This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. Are the birth control methods of natural family planning and rhythm acceptable alternatives to artificial contraception? Is it permissible for a Catholic to practice so-called natural means of birth control and to deliberately limit the size of his or her family? Countless people believe and have been taught that the answer to those questions is yes. In this video, we will see why they are gravely mistaken. I will demonstrate that NFP, natural family planning, rhythm, and related methods are contrary to Catholic teaching and sacred scripture. In fact, by carefully considering the precise methods used in NFP and related practices, it will be demonstrated that they are equivalent to artificial contraception in both intention and reality. When NFP is mentioned in this video, it might describe standard natural family planning or fertility awareness method, or the more primitive form called the rhythm method, or the umbrella term that is used to describe an array of similar practices. All of these methods focus upon identifying the infertile periods of the woman and restricting marital relations to the infertile periods in order to avoid a pregnancy. And obviously, when we're talking about NFP in this video, we are talking about those who use it to avoid a pregnancy, not those who use it to achieve one. The proponents of NFP acknowledge that the Catholic Church has condemned artificial contraception. There is no doubt about this. In his 1930 encyclical Casti Connubii, Pope Pius XI solemnly declared that any use of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. However, supporters of NFP contend that NFP is different from artificial contraception. They claim that NFP does not frustrate the sexual act in marriage, and it doesn't alter a woman's body chemistry, as contraceptives do. Before we examine and refute those claims, let's make one thing clear. NFP is birth control. It is used to avoid pregnancy and to limit families. This is openly admitted in materials which promote and teach NFP. In the following YouTube video put out by the Vatican to, quote, Diocese of Rochester, New York, called Hidden Blessings, Natural Family Planning, they openly admit that NFP is for those who wish to limit the number of children they have. In addition, notice the manner in which they appeal to the worldly people and the secularized world. Typical of the spiritually bankrupt modernist church, they do not reach out to them with the truths of Jesus Christ, such as that God opens and shuts the womb, Genesis 30 verse 2, and that women are saved by childbearing, 1 Timothy 2:15. No, they attempt to lure people in with a false message spiced up with catchy music.
This DVD is a very candid, unscripted, and unrehearsed glimpse into the lives of 4 diverse families who choose to use natural family planning to space and limit the number of children that they have. They all live and work in the Diocese of Rochester. Through this DVD, they share both the struggles they've encountered and the blessings they've received in their marriages by using NFP. Anne and Steve Bone have been married a few years and have 1 child, and Anne is an OB/GYN nurse. Bernie and Ville-Marie Hero weren't ready to have children right away when they were first married. Nina and Jose Rivera wanted to learn how to space their children.
As we can see, NFP is openly advertised as a way to avoid children and limit families. In the following clips, notice again that NFP is embraced by those who do not want to have children, or at least only a few. NFP is the path chosen by those with the same contraceptive mentality as the practitioners of artificial means of birth control. It is even promoted because it is a, quote, healthier way to avoid children. The obvious implication is that avoiding the negative health effects of artificial contraceptives is the reason to choose NFP instead of artificial contraception.
So it's a really good tool because you can use it either way. If you would like to have a baby, it's really effective. if you want to postpone a pregnancy, if you don't want to have more babies, is also really a very effective tool.
But I also knew in a more stronger way that I didn't want to have kids quite right away.
And it was something that we planned, well, once we do have our family, this will be something that we can use afterwards, because it's a healthier way as opposed to being on hormones that can have all different sorts of effects on you. It's a science. It's a good thing for people to use if they don't want to use birth control and they don't want to have the potential side effects or long-term effects after using something like that.
As we can see very clearly, NFP is contraception. It's just another way of going about it. This fact was also captured in a local CBS News report published in a YouTube video called Increased Interest in Natural Family Planning. In the video, notice the admission that NFP is birth control, that NFP has been adopted by the practitioners of artificial contraception, who simply want a, quote, drug-free approach, that NFP is so effective that many non-Catholics have adopted it, and that NFP can prevent pregnancy 99% of the time, a rate that's comparable to artificial contraception.
It used to be called the rhythm method and was a type of birth control identified with Catholics. But doctors say newer, more accurate methods have generated renewed interest in natural family planning, especially among people who want a more natural, drug-free approach.
It's natural. It doesn't involve drugs, doesn't involve side effects, doesn't mess with your body chemistry.
Dr. Joseph Stanford is a family practice physician who is an advocate for natural family planning. He says it can be an accurate and safe way to prevent pregnancy. Stanford says a recent study shows women are becoming increasingly interested in this option, regardless of their religion or background, and says the majority of patients who use it find it so effective they stick with it. While more women may be interested, Dr. Stanford says most doctors tend to dismiss natural family planning, unaware of the modern updates to these methods, which, by the way, are said to be up to 99% effective in preventing pregnancy.
Now, before we further demonstrate that NFP is no different from artificial contraception, let's consider the simplest and most straightforward magisterial argument against NFP. Catholic dogma teaches us that the primary purpose of marriage and the conjugal act is the procreation and education of children. Pope Pius XI, Casti Connubii, quote, "The primary end of marriage is the procreation and the education of children," end quote. He also declared, quote, "Since therefore the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children, those who, in exercising it, deliberately frustrate its natural powers and purpose, sin against nature, and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious." End quote. Notice the reference to the purpose of marriage and the conjugal act. Besides this primary purpose, the begetting of children, there are secondary purposes for marriage, such as mutual aid, the quieting of concupiscence, and the cultivating of mutual love. But these secondary purposes must always remain subordinate to the primary purpose of marriage, the procreation and education of children. This is the key point to remember in the discussion of NFP. Pope Pius XI declared, quote, "For in matrimony, as well as in the use of the matrimonial rite, there are also secondary ends, such as mutual aid, the cultivating of mutual love, and the quieting of concupiscence, which husband and wife are not forbidden to consider, so long as they are subordinated to the primary end, and so long as the intrinsic nature of the act is preserved." End quote. Notice the capitalized portion. That means that even if NFP does not directly interfere with the marriage act itself, or the woman's natural ability to conceive, and there are some interesting considerations we will get to in this regard, it doesn't matter. NFP is still sinful because it clearly subordinates the primary end or purpose of marriage and the marriage act, the procreation and education of children, to other things. Think about it. Could one argue that NFP does not subordinate the primary purpose of the marriage act, when the primary purpose is to have children, and those who use NFP to avoid pregnancy are attempting to avoid the primary purpose? No, of course not. NFP clearly subordinates the primary purpose of the marriage act to other things, and it is therefore contrary to Catholic teaching. Typically, NFP subordinates the primary purpose of the conjugal act to financial considerations, worldly desires, and selfish plans. The proponents of NFP often object that NFP is simply abstinence, and how can abstinence be a sin? NFP is not abstinence. NFP is selective abstinence at those times when it is believed the woman can become pregnant. NFP does not leave matters in God's hands. It is not natural. It is a man-made scheme by which people go out of their way to avoid the results of marital relations, to avoid the primary purpose of the marriage act, and that's why it's a sin. Practitioners of NFP are definitely not open to life when they track a woman's cycle to find out when she cannot become pregnant. They are no more open to life than a person who buys a condom, uses it, but resigns himself to God's will if it breaks and the woman is impregnated. NFP is primarily a sin of intention. The intention of those who use NFP is exactly the same as the intention of those who use artificial contraception, to have relations while avoiding children. Now, we must consider something that's extremely important in this regard. One of the arguments defenders of NFP raise is that artificial contraceptives are totally different from NFP because artificial contraceptives impede the natural completion of the sexual act, while NFP does not. We've already seen that this is irrelevant, because sexual relations are sinful if the primary purpose is subordinated to other things, even if the natural completion of the act is unimpeded. The primary purpose of the act is subordinated and in fact avoided in NFP. But a more careful consideration of NFP methods actually demonstrates that there is another alarming similarity between methods of NFP and methods of artificial contraception. Consider that not all forms of artificial contraception impede the natural completion of the sexual act. For example, birth control pills prevent pregnancy, but they are used before the sexual act. People who use the pill can still complete the sexual act in the way that people who are trying to have a child would. Now, the defender of NFP will respond by saying, yes, that's true, but those pills alter a woman's body chemistry, affecting hormone levels to prevent ovulation, and that's why it's a sin. Okay, so we now agree that sinful contraception does not simply include devices or methods that impede the natural completion of the sexual act itself, such as a condom, but any effort to alter a woman's body chemistry before, during, or after the act for the purpose of making conception more difficult than it would be naturally. And I say more difficult because even with birth control pills, conception is still possible, just far less likely. Therefore, defenders of NFP must agree that taking a positive step to alter a woman's body chemistry or hormone levels in order to make conception more difficult is condemned artificial contraception. Well, the fact is, that's what people do in NFP. NFP involves taking a step to physically alter a woman's body chemistry for the purpose of making her physically less receptive to conception, just as in methods of artificial contraception. Let me prove it. Did you know that natural family planning methods include recommendations for demand breastfeeding for the purpose of avoiding pregnancy? That's correct. Lots of breastfeeding can alter the hormones in a woman's body to prevent ovulation. Here's a quote from a natural family planning workbook called Honoring Our Cycles by Katie Singer, page 42. Quote, how does a couple space their children? They know when the wife is fertile and they do not have intercourse on those days. Also, the mother breastfeeds. End quote. Now let me make one thing very clear. Am I saying that breastfeeding is a sin? No, absolutely not. Am I saying that demand breastfeeding is a sin? No. Am I saying that people should not exclusively breastfeed? No. Traditional Catholics who reject NFP should not have any scruple at all about breastfeeding as much as they feel their child needs it. The point is this: if you are breastfeeding primarily or only to avoid children, then you have a corrupt intention. And the inclusion of demand breastfeeding recommendations for the purpose of avoiding children, in basically all methods of NFP, shows a willingness on the part of NFP users to take steps that physically alter a woman's body chemistry to prevent ovulation, just as in artificial contraception. For it's simply a fact that breastfeeding does affect a woman's hormone levels and body chemistry, and it can prevent ovulation. Here are clips from a YouTube video put out by Planned Parenthood, the largest promoter of abortion and contraception in the world. The video is called Planned Parenthood: How is Breastfeeding Used as Birth Control? Notice the promotion of breastfeeding as birth control and to physically alter a woman's hormone levels to prevent pregnancy.
When it comes to feeding a newborn, you've probably heard that the breast is best, right? Well, did you also know that breastfeeding can be used as birth control? That's right. Simply breastfeeding your baby regularly and exclusively can help you prevent another pregnancy for 6 months. How does it work? Well, if you breastfeed exclusively, that means no formula or other baby foods. The hormones in your body will naturally change to prevent ovulation, the release of an egg. No egg, no pregnancy. Breastfeeding is incredibly effective as birth control. So effective that for every 100 women who breastfeed continuously for the first 6 months after birth, only 1 or 2 of them will get pregnant.
As we can see, breastfeeding physically alters a woman's hormone levels just as a contraceptive pill does. Hence, the willingness of NFP users to breastfeed for the purpose of avoiding pregnancy proves that NFP is not just about abstinence, a complete lie, but includes taking positive steps to physically alter a woman's body chemistry or hormone levels for the purpose of preventing ovulation. Let me repeat that: for the purpose of preventing ovulation. In that way, that is, when one breastfeeds solely or primarily for the purpose of avoiding pregnancy, it is no different from taking a contraceptive pill. Moreover, it is no defense to point out that breastfeeding is a natural activity. That's true, but irrelevant. A natural activity carried out in an unnatural way or for an unnatural purpose is a sin. The natural activity must be carried out for the natural purpose and with the proper intention that God ordained. To breastfeed in order to avoid children, rather than to nourish the child, reveals a sinful intention. Just as it is sinful and unnatural to carry out a plan to abstain from marital relations when it is believed a woman is fertile, and have relations as part of the same plan when it is believed she is not. The plan and the scheme is to avoid children while having relations, and that's sinful because it subordinates and circumvents the primary purpose God ordained for conjugal relations, the procreation of children. It should also be emphasized that even if a user of NFP does not employ the breastfeed for the purpose of avoiding children method, but focuses on other aspects of NFP, NFP is still sinful. The breastfeed for the purpose of avoiding children component of NFP is not what makes NFP sinful. It's simply one revealing byproduct of the evil practice. It demonstrates what NFP users are willing to do, that is, to physically alter hormone levels to avoid children. The sin in NFP is the plan, the steps taken to avoid children while having relations. And since NFP is corrupt to the core and equivalent to artificial contraception in intention, it makes sense that NFP would give rise to practices that are directly comparable to artificial contraception, not only in intention but in act. On its website, EWTN, the quote, Global Catholic Network, features an article by the Couple to Couple League, the largest natural family planning provider in the U.S. The article is entitled, "What Does the Church Teach About Birth Control?" It states, quote, "Can breastfeeding really space babies? Yes. More pregnancies are postponed throughout the world through breastfeeding than through any of the methods that can be called conscious efforts at birth regulation. However, this is true only of ecological breastfeeding, in which mothers are constantly with their babies, who in turn suckle frequently." End quote. EWTN thus promotes and endorses breastfeeding for the purpose of avoiding children. Another method of NFP is called the Billings ovulation method by Dr. John Billings. This method is explained on the website woomb.org. This natural family planning method is promoted by LifeSite News and many other false, quote, Catholic groups. In our day, almost all priests and groups that purport to be Catholic accept and promote NFP. The Fraternity of St. Peter, the Society of St. Pius X, the CMRI, the Society of St. Pius V, and almost all Novus Ordo and independent priests promote methods of NFP. The priests of the CMRI, a heretical group that purports to be traditionally Catholic, actively recommend the Billings ovulation birth control method of NFP. On the website explaining the method, it states, quote, breastfeeding. Demand feeding is strongly recommended and will greatly assist to suppress fertility, end quote. NFP in all forms is sinful, but it's very interesting to note that a method of NFP that is widely recommended by so-called conservative and traditionalist, quote, Catholics includes steps that physically alter a woman's hormone levels for the purpose of preventing pregnancy. This shows without any doubt that they are proponents of a method that is no different in act, not to mention in intention, from artificial contraception. These groups, as well as all others who promote the sinful birth control practice called NFP, are false guides and false shepherds who lead souls into sin and into hell. Before I cover more evidence against NFP, including some very important quotes from Catholic tradition, a few objections must be addressed. Supporters of NFP like to bring up the fact that in a few speeches in the 1950s, Pius XII approved observing the infertile periods to avoid conception, what we would today call NFP, a method that was becoming more widespread at the time. The most well-known of those speeches is his October 29, 1951 address to midwives. The answer to this objection is that Pius XII's statements in this regard were definitely not infallible or magisterial. They were simply wrong. His comments came in speeches to individual groups of people, not in documents addressed to the universal church or to all the bishops and binding upon all the faithful. Since his speeches lack a universal and binding character, they are definitely not infallible, neither by way of the solemn magisterium nor by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Pius XII's comments were actually false, outrageous, and irresponsible, and they have had disastrous consequences, just like a number of his other actions. While his election in 1939 was valid, Pius XII's failures made him a bridge to the modernist revolution that later occurred. This revolution exploded into a counter-church shortly after his death in 1962 at Vatican II. Pius XII's statements on NFP contradict the previous infallible and authoritative teaching of Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Casti Connubii on how the primary purpose of the conjugal act must not be subordinated to other things. As we will see, Pius XII's speeches also contradict the teaching of the Fathers of the Church on the intention that must be present when married couples have conjugal relations. People who think that a pope could never make a mistake or teach something theologically or morally erroneous are ignorant of Catholic teaching on papal infallibility. They are also unfamiliar with Catholic history. When addressing faith and morals, a pope is infallible only when speaking from the chair of Peter in a solemn fashion, or when reiterating what the Church has always taught in its ordinary and universal magisterium. This is the teaching of Vatican I. If a pope does not fulfill those requirements, such as when he is writing a letter or giving a speech to midwives, he can be completely wrong. A study of papal history demonstrates that numerous popes promoted wrong theological views when expressing themselves in a non-magisterial capacity. In a notorious case of papal error, Pope John XXII, who died in 1334, held the false view that the elect or saved will not receive the beatific vision until after the general judgment. Like Pius XII, Pope John XXII gave numerous speeches to promote his false view. The dogmatic teaching of Pope Benedict XII in Benedictus Deus 1336 proved that John XXII was completely wrong. In another example of papal error, Pope John IV, 7th century, wrongly attempted to defend as misinterpreted or misunderstood heretical words of Pope Honorius, words which were later condemned authoritatively by the Third Council of Constantinople and other councils. Speaking of Pope Honorius, he was condemned as a heretic himself by the Third Council of Constantinople in 680. Other examples of popes teaching error, when they did not fulfill the requirements to teach infallibly, could be given. The Church not only teaches that a pope can make mistakes in a non-infallible or non-magisterial capacity, but that if a pope becomes a clear heretic, he loses the papal office ipso facto by that very fact. And if a man is a heretic before the election is invalid and he does not assume the office of pope. This is the infallible teaching of the Catholic Church. See, for example, Pope Paul IV in his bull Cum ex Apostolatus Officio. This teaching applies to what occurred during the Vatican II revolution. Please see our website, vaticancatholic.com, for the information on that issue. It's simply a fact that shortly after the death of Pius XII, the men who led the Vatican II revolution from John XXIII to the current Benedict XVI denied many Catholic dogmas, including the necessity of Christ, the constitution of the Church, the binding nature of councils, the dogmatic teaching of the Church on non-Catholic religions, and more. Since they were and are heretics, according to Catholic teaching, they did not become true popes, but actually anti-popes. This does not contradict indefectibility or the promises of Christ to his Church or concerning the papacy, but actually ensures them, because it guarantees that no non-member of the society will lead it into heresy or error. The true Church still exists in the remnant of Catholics who maintain the fullness of the faith. This great apostasy occurred shortly after the death of Pius XII, but the seeds of it were sown during his reign and before. Therefore, those who think they are justified using the sinful birth control practice called NFP, because Pius XII supported it in a few speeches that were fallible and given at a time when modernism was growing and about to explode into a full-fledged counter-church, are very deceived. We've already shown that NFP is clearly incompatible with the teaching of the Church on the primary purpose of the conjugal act, and that NFP is in fact equivalent to artificial contraception in both intention and reality. Those who use NFP know that they are attempting to thwart the will of God, the one who opens and shuts the womb. It's very interesting to note that Pius XII, in expressing his false and outrageous support for NFP-type methods, says on the one hand that they can only be used for serious or, quote, exceptional reasons, something that's not true because NFP cannot be used at all legitimately. Yet on the other hand, he lists among those reasons social, medical, economic, and even eugenic indications. In fact, in the same speech to midwives, Pius XII contradicts his position by asserting, quote, "The use of the natural procreative disposition is morally lawful in matrimony only in the service of and in accordance with the ends of marriage itself." End quote. He also states, quote, "Now the truth is that matrimony as an institution of nature in virtue of the Creator's will has not as a primary and intimate end the personal perfection of the married couple, but the procreation and upbringing of a new life. The other ends, inasmuch as they are intended by nature, are not equally primary, much less superior to the primary end, but are essentially subordinated to it." End quote. So according to him, marital relations are lawful only if performed in accord with the end of marriage. Well, we already saw that the infallible teaching of the Church is that the primary end of marriage and the marriage act is procreation. Pius XII acknowledges it, and this primary end must not be subordinated to other things. To attempt to avoid the primary end, as in NFP, is not to act in accord with the end, but against it. Therefore, Pius XII's very own statement contradicts NFP. Another objection advanced by defenders of NFP birth control methods concerns responses allegedly given by members of the Sacred Penitentiary before Vatican II. I will now address and refute this objection. Two of these responses came in the 19th century and one in the 20th. This objection has been raised by Novus Ordo quote priest Brian Harrison, a man who accepts an array of modernist heresies, as well as Mark Pavarounnis of the CMRI, who holds that souls can be saved in false religions, including Muslims and Jews who reject Jesus Christ. These men believe the responses of the Sacred Penitentiary prove the lawfulness of NFP. They are quite wrong. The responses concerned whether couples who limited intercourse to periods then believed to be infertile ought to be disturbed. The answers, given at a time when very little was known about the stunning effectiveness of NFP birth control methods, which are now known to be more effective than condoms and onanism, and as effective as the contraceptive pill, indicated in so many words that the couples need not be disturbed. In other words, that apparently it was permissible for them to limit intercourse to days believed to be infertile. However, the 1880 response said it was lawful only in the case of people who would otherwise practice onanism, which obviously would apply to very few users of NFP. Regardless, this argument is false and does not provide any justification for NFP in any case, simply because the Sacred Penitentiary is a tribunal of the Roman Curia. It is not infallible. Moreover, modernism was known to be spreading rapidly in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it became so widespread by 1907, when Pope Pius X published his encyclical Pascendi, that he stated, quote, "They, the modernists, put their designs for her ruin into operation not from without, but from within. Hence the danger is present almost in the very veins and heart of the Church, whose injury is the more certain, the more intimate is their knowledge of her." End quote. According to Pius X, at the time he published his encyclical, the modernists were almost in the very veins and heart of the Church. A heretic is automatically expelled from the Church for denying the faith, but a modernist heretic could purport to occupy a position of Church leadership, such as priest or bishop, and in that way having influence over members of the Church who wrongly think he is part of it. A modernist could assault the Church near its heart. If modernism was so widespread at the time of Pius X, it would be foolish to believe that the members of the Roman Curia, who were responsible for many of these decisions, were immune to it. The Roman Curia consisted of Roman congregations, tribunals, and offices of clergy. A decision reached by one of the many parts of the Roman Curia, such as the Sacred Penitentiary, does not have infallibility unless a pope repromulgates it in forma specifica, in specific form. That's the teaching of the Church. Here's what the Catholic Encyclopedia says about Roman congregations and tribunals, and this would apply to a tribunal such as the Sacred Penitentiary. Quote, "It should be observed, in conclusion, that papal infallibility is a personal and incommunicable charisma, which is not shared by any pontifical tribunal. It was promised directly to Peter and to each of Peter's successors in the primacy, but not as a prerogative the exercise of which could be delegated to others. Hence, doctrinal decisions or instructions issued by the Roman congregations, even when approved by the Pope in the ordinary way, have no claim to be considered infallible. To be infallible, they must be issued by the Pope himself in his own name, according to the conditions already mentioned as requisite for ex cathedra teaching." End quote. Notice that decisions of Roman congregations and tribunals, such as the Holy Office or the Sacred Penitentiary, are not in themselves infallible or protected. In fact, in the 17th century, during the Galileo affair, 11 theologians of the Holy Office condemned heliocentrism, and the Congregation of the Index at the time forbade the publication of heliocentric works. In 1633, the Holy Office condemned the denial of geocentrism as heretical. Yet in the centuries that followed, these Roman congregations reversed their position and allowed the publication of heliocentric works. That's just one clear example of how a congregation or tribunal of the Curia can be completely wrong, and that their decisions, if not confirmed in forma specifica by the Pope, are not infallible. Furthermore, and this is very interesting to consider, the aforementioned responses of the Penitentiary were not even published in any single official organ of the Church. They were circulated in non-official collections. Prior to the 20th century, canon law itself was not found in one single volume, but was circulated in a variety of collections, not one of which was official and complete. The same is true of decisions of congregations and tribunals. They were collected in a variety of works, including those of private scholars. Therefore, it's not as if there was a single volume, which all priests consulted, with all of the official responses, including these few obscure responses on infertile periods. No, that's not how it worked. The initial 1853 response was a response to a single bishop, and was known by hardly any of the faithful. If you were going to take a response to a single bishop and stake your salvation on it, despite the fact that the method endorsed clearly contradicts the infallible teaching of the Church on the primary purpose of the conjugal act, and how that must not be subordinated to other things, well then, you are making a very foolish choice. In fact, Pope Innocent III, in his letter Ex parte Tua, January 12, 1206, to the Archbishop of Lyon, stated that original sin was remitted by circumcision. This position was later contradicted and proven false by the Council of Trent. If Pope Innocent III can be wrong in a letter to a bishop, then a member of the Curia, responding at a time of increasing modernism, can be as well. But even if we did not have specific infallible teaching to contradict the sinful birth control practice of NFP, and we do, people who use it would still be guilty. That's because they know in their hearts that they are thwarting the will of God by going out of their way to avoid children while having marital relations. Bad priests and bad shepherds can lead people to hell, as Jesus warned in Matthew 7:15, but the Church's infallible teaching cannot. In 1846, Our Lady of La Salette prophesied that, quote, in the year 1864, Lucifer, together with a large number of demons, will be unloosed from hell. They will put an end to faith little by little, even in those dedicated to God. End quote. Our Lady said this would culminate in the complete takeover of Rome by a counter-church of the Antichrist. Quote, Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. The Church will be in eclipse. End quote. This takeover of Rome by a counter-church, reducing the true Church to a remnant, began with the reign of John XXIII and Vatican II. However, the movement toward the counter-church started with the errors and heresies that were being sown before Vatican II in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, in summary on this point, the fact that some members of the Sacred Penitentiary before Vatican II at a time of growing modernism gave some form of support to primitive NFP methods provides no justification whatsoever for the sinful birth control practice called NFP, which contradicts infallible Catholic teaching and tradition, as we will see. Additionally, at the time that NFP promotion was bubbling up in certain places, many theologians also came to adopt the condemned heresy that Jesus Christ and the Catholic faith are not necessary for salvation. This is more evidence that a major doctrinal breakdown was underway in the years before Vatican II. The final objection raised by defenders of NFP, which we must consider and refute, concerns a passage in Casti Connubii which they pervert. This passage does not support NFP, it actually contradicts it, yet defenders of NFP cite it anyway. First, it needs to be understood that while NFP is definitely sinful, there aren't particular times of the month or the year when married couples are forbidden to use their marital rights. In other words, it's not as if there is a positive obligation for married couples to find out when a woman is fertile and then restrict marital relations to those times in an effort to get pregnant. That's not a requirement. People shouldn't even be concerned with fertile or infertile periods. They should leave that up to God. Let the Creator plan the family. Therefore, if a married couple has relations and the woman does not get pregnant, either due to the time it occurred or an inherent defect on the part of one of the spouses, there is no sin. That makes perfect sense, of course, for in that case there was no attempt, no effort, no plan to avoid children while having relations, as there is in NFP. It just happened that way. That's all that Pope Pius XI is saying in the following sentence. Casti Connubii number 59, quote, Nor are those considered as acting against nature, who in the married state use their right in the proper manner, although on account of natural reasons, either of time or of certain defects, new life cannot be brought forth. End quote. Pius XI is not endorsing NFP. But what's so interesting about this passage, and it actually serves to crush NFP, is that the very next sentence, I repeat, the very next sentence, is where Pope Pius XI articulates the principle that completely contradicts NFP. He states, quote, For in matrimony, as well as in the use of the matrimonial rite, there are also secondary ends, such as mutual aid, the cultivating of mutual love, and the quieting of concupiscence, which husband and wife are not forbidden to consider, so long as they are subordinated to the primary end, and so long as the intrinsic nature of the act is preserved." End quote. Pius XI states that marital relations, from which new life is not brought forth as a result of time or nature, the issue he mentioned in the previous sentence, can only be considered lawful when the secondary ends of marriage remain subordinate to the primary one, the procreation and education of children. That refutes NFP, for in NFP the method is used to avoid the primary end, to avoid children, to subordinate that end to other things. That's a fact. It's not an accident that this sentence comes right after the one dealing with new life not being brought forth naturally on account of time or certain defects. God made sure that the paragraph would appear this way, to contradict the promoters of NFP and birth control. The second sentence, about the inadmissibility of subordinating the primary purpose in marital relations, coming right after the first sentence, about new life not being brought forth naturally on account of time or certain defects, makes it crystal clear in context that marital relations in which new life is not brought forward can only be considered lawful when the procreation of children remains the primary purpose of those relations, which of course does not happen in NFP. Also notice that Pope Pius XI in this paragraph draws a distinction between subordinating the primary end of marriage and corrupting the intrinsic nature of the act. According to practitioners of NFP, the only thing that is forbidden is corrupting the intrinsic nature of the act, for example, using a condom, practicing onanism, etc. But Pius XI's paragraph shows that even if the intrinsic nature of the act is preserved, the primary end could still be subordinated to other things. That's the case in NFP. Even though they're not corrupting the intrinsic nature of the act, they are subordinating the primary end by attempting to avoid children while having relations. Thus, this passage confirms that any method that attempts to avoid the primary end of marriage is condemned. So, not only does the passage they quote from Casti Connubii not support NFP, in context it completely excludes and contradicts it. That brings us to the teaching of the Fathers of the Church and ancient Catholic tradition on the desire for children that married couples must have when engaging in lawful marital relations. It's very interesting that Cardinal Ottaviani, who unfortunately became a modernist heretic himself, nevertheless criticized the radical teaching of Vatican II on birth control. He noted how it contradicted all of Catholic history. Quote, Cardinal Ottaviani spoke on the following day. "I am not pleased," he said, "with the statement in the text that married couples may determine the number of children they are to have. Never has this been heard of in the Church. He was the 11th son in a family of 12 children, he said. My father was a laborer, and the fear of having many children never entered my parents' minds, because they trusted in Providence." End quote. Ottaviani, who probably never would have even existed if his parents had used NFP, was correct in stating that birth control methods such as NFP contradict Catholic tradition. St. Caesar of Arles, 6th century bishop and father of the Church, stated, quote, "As often as he knows his wife without a desire for children, without a doubt he commits sin." End quote. For the sake of clarity, we should point out that the minimal desire people must have when engaging in marital relations is that they must at least desire children in the sense that they are open to life should God send it, and they are not taking any positive steps to avoid having children, as one does in NFP. Like St. Caesar of Arles, St. Augustine expressed the same teaching of tradition. St. Augustine, Contra Faustum, Book 22, number 61, quote, "Undoubtedly, by the eternal law, which requires the preservation of natural order, and forbids the transgression of it, conjugal intercourse should take place only for the procreation of children and after the celebration of marriage, so as to maintain the bond of peace." End quote. St. Jerome, father and doctor of the Church, taught the same thing. Against Jovinianus, Book 1, number 20, 393, quote, "Does he, Jovinianus imagine that we approve of any sexual intercourse except for the procreation of children?" End quote. How is NFP compatible with this teaching of tradition when NFP is used to avoid the procreation of children? It's not compatible, obviously. To say otherwise is to lie. NFP is a novelty of Satan, and those who use it commit grave sin. The rejection of this traditional teaching on marital relations, beginning with errors in fallible sources before Vatican II, resulted in the radical birth control agenda promoted by Vatican II and by the post-Vatican II counterchurch. In number 51 of Vatican II's heretical document Gaudium et Spes, it states that modern conditions may dictate for people that, quote, the size of their families should not be increased, end quote. In number 87 of the same document, Vatican II states that couples should decide how many children they are to have, and that methods may be used to regulate the number of their children. Quote, men should discreetly be informed, furthermore, of scientific advances in exploring methods whereby spouses can be helped in regulating the number of their children, end quote. In number 16 of his much-discussed and totally evil encyclical, Humanae Vitae, Anti-Pope Paul VI, a man who also taught that Islam binds people to God and that Eastern schismatics should not be converted, admitted that limiting intercourse to infertile periods, that is NFP, is birth control. He also states that this birth control method may be used for a, quote, psychological condition of husband or wife, among other reasons. He also says that people may, quote, abstain from intercourse during the fertile period as often as for reasonable motives the birth of another child is not desirable, end quote. He also says that couples are justified in, quote, their intention to avoid children and wish to make sure that none will result, end quote. That doesn't sound very pro-life or open to God's plan, does it? No, that's because it isn't. NFP requires the same anti-procreative mentality as artificial contraception. Both resist God's plan for life. Both step into the contraceptive process. And once the false teaching on NFP and birth control took hold among almost all professing Catholics, the size of families decreased dramatically, as countless souls were phased out of existence. As a result, Western culture is currently on pace to disappear completely, with birth rates below replacement level in the United States and many European countries. Opponents of abortion often ponder the countless lives that could not be lived as a result of abortion. Most of them do not think about the souls lost through abortion, souls that died in original sin before they could be regenerated in baptism. And they certainly don't consider the myriad of individuals robbed of existence itself by selfish couples who practiced NFP and other forms of contraception. Have you ever meditated on the thought that you might not have existed, that your parents, through a birth control method, could have snuffed you out before you were ever conceived? In that case, what would have become of you? The answer is that you would not be at all. The thought should boggle the mind. Yet the practitioners of NFP have done just that to innumerable souls who, unlike you, never had a chance for life, neither temporal nor eternal. St. Catherine of Siena was the 23rd child in a family of 25 children. She never would have existed if her parents had used NFP. St. Ignatius of Loyola was the 13th child of 13 children. He would not have existed if his parents had used NFP. The same could be said of many other saints. In 1917, Our Lady of Fatima appeared to Lucia, the 7th of 7 children, Francisco, the 8th of 9 children, and Jacinta, the 9th of 9 children. Is it an accident that heaven granted this extraordinary message to the final children in these large families? No. It was a reminder that God has a specific purpose in every child he sends, and that only by complete openness to his will and his plan will the greatest graces come. Seek first the kingdom of God and his justice, and all things will be added unto you. Matthew 6:33. A mother of many children, who was about to become a mother once more, came to St. John Vianney. "Oh, I am so advanced in years, Father," she said. St. John Vianney responded, quote, "Be comforted, my child, if you only knew the women who will go to hell, because they did not bring into the world the children they should have given to it." End quote. 1 Timothy 2:15, quote, "Yet she shall be saved through childbearing, if she continue in faith and love and sanctification, with sobriety." End quote. A final point must be made on the similarity between NFP and artificial contraception, as well as on the blindness exhibited by NFP users. Here are two interesting clips from a YouTube video called "Why Use Natural Family Planning" by a so-called Catholic user of NFP.
Natural family planning really works. We have 3 children right now, and that's the number that we wanted when we got married, and we're not currently planning to have any more. Natural family planning is as effective at avoiding pregnancy as other common chemical contraceptives.
As covered earlier, many openly non-Catholic practitioners of birth control who are not concerned with following Catholic teaching have stopped using artificial contraception. They have begun to use natural family planning instead. They have switched from artificial contraception to NFP simply because they realized that with NFP they can accomplish the exact same thing without the negative health effects of artificial contraceptives. That brings up a very interesting point. But first consider these clips from a YouTube video called "In Brief, My NFP Experience." The woman speaking, who admittedly is not a follower of Catholic teaching, explains why she now uses NFP instead of the birth control pill.
How I got interested in natural family planning was that I was on the birth control pill for about 6 months when I first got married, and it was a really bad idea for me. Something that doctors probably don't mention very often as a very actually serious side effect or risk of taking the birth control pill or any hormonal birth control is the chance of clotting, blood clotting. And I started having chest pains, and in my family history, there is a history of blood clotting and blood issues, so just taking that type of birth control pill was a bad idea for me. So I went off the birth control pill, and I have a friend who has a sister who's a nurse, who is an instructor for the Billings ovulation method of natural family planning, which is pretty much the first scientifically researched form of, that was really researched out, form of birth control. If you don't have a lot of time to read and you're not quite into the Catholic theology, because there's a lot of that in there, I recommend you just go find yourself an instructor, either a Billings ovulation method instructor or a Creighton model.
This person is not a Catholic. She switched to NFP not because she believed using the birth control pill is contrary to God's law, but simply for fear of blood clots. She realized that by using NFP she could accomplish the same objective, preventing pregnancy, without blood clotting. So think about this. So-called Catholic defenders of NFP would have to admit that she committed mortal sin when she used the birth control pill. Yet now she uses NFP. So did her actions go from mortally sinful to not sinful? She has the exact same intention as when she used the pill, to avoid children. She is also accomplishing the same thing as when she used the pill. She is having relations while avoiding pregnancy, and she has the same position on the moral acceptability of artificial contraception that she did while using the birth control pill. That is, apparently she doesn't have a problem with it. So, by switching from the pill to NFP, has the mortally sinful activity morphed into justified activity? Of course not. Nothing has changed. She is still deliberately avoiding pregnancy while having relations. This example illustrates quite well how intention matters. If a person's intention is to avoid children while having relations, then that person commits mortal sin, whether the method employed is artificial contraception or natural family planning. It doesn't make a difference. This truth is also demonstrated by the following clips from a YouTube video called "Natural Birth Control: Safe, Effective, and Little Known."
I don't like the idea of taking hormones for birth control, or like the idea of an IUD just freaks me out, because it's possible to conceive with any method, and a lot of those conceptions result in miscarriage because of the choice that you made in birth control, and that freaks me out. I don't want to, like, if I conceive a child, I don't want to miscarry it because of my choice of contraceptive, and that just, I don't know, it scares me. And so there wasn't really a method that I felt comfortable using, but you have to use something, right? So one of the girls in my mom's group lent me this book, Taking Charge of Your Fertility. Maybe you've seen it before. And it is what it says, the definitive guide to natural birth control, pregnancy achievement, and reproductive health. This method, it's called the fertility awareness method, helps you identify using both charting and symptoms to determine when that fertility window is. And then during that window, you can make the choice to either abstain or use. What shocks me the most is that I've never heard of this. Rather than explaining to me like that there's this natural method, even after I ask my doctor, all of the doctors I've ever had for this kind of thing, they either say, you know, you take the pill, you use this thing called the NuvaRing, or you get an IUD, and all of them have negative side effects, are potentially unsafe, you can still conceive and then miscarry the baby. I've asked so many people, is there a natural way? And nobody's given me this information, and it's like shocking, because when this method is used consistently and properly, like any method of birth control, it's 99% effective. Isn't that crazy? That's the same as any oral contraception. So why ingest all these additional hormones and like have crazy weight gain and go just mentally wacko because of all the additional hormones when there's a natural method? That's so easy.
As we can see, NFP is equivalent to artificial contraception. Openly non-Catholic proponents of NFP have no problem acknowledging this fact because they aren't concerned with dishonestly appearing to follow Catholic teaching when they don't, or claiming to be open to new life when they aren't. Certainly that's not to say that the non-Catholics are justified, for they obviously aren't, and they cannot be saved without the Catholic faith. It's simply to point out that they will frequently identify NFP for what it really is. And that brings us to one of the most important aspects of the NFP movement, that is the astounding blindness and self-deception exhibited by so-called Catholic practitioners of NFP. NFP promotional material consistently presents the method as if it's a submission to God's design and open to new life, when the truth is exactly the opposite. NFP constitutes a deliberate attempt to resist what God sends and avoid new life. Darkness being described as light is indicative of a completely wicked generation. Consider the truly absurd terms in which this sinful birth avoidance method is praised in the following clips from a YouTube video put out by the Vatican II, quote, Diocese of Phoenix, called Diocese of Phoenix Natural Family Planning Promo Video. The following descriptions are typical of NFP promotional material, in which the birth avoidance method is not only falsely identified as, quote, life-giving, but essentially treated as a savior, apparently because it allows them to have relations while avoiding the children they don't want.
Natural family planning forces you to appreciate the complexity of your wife.
Natural family planning. Natural family planning.
Natural family planning is
empowering.
Life-giving.
They're really a hidden treasure.
Unifying for marriages. It's the foundation for our marriage.
What a gift.
Natural family planning.
Natural family planning.
Natural family planning is
freedom for marriages.
After saying all of that, notice how their true motive is revealed in the following clip. That is, their desperate fear of accepting the children God will send, and their implementation of a method to avoid them.
I think the biggest fear is that it won't be effective, and that they're going to have 20 kids.
A fear of my own fertility. I really started with a fear. My first preconceived notion was that it was the rhythm method.
Kind of the Catholic Church's way to make sure that all women were barefoot and pregnant all the time.
I always had that unknown of, okay, what are we going to do to control our family? I didn't know.
More of the same extremely disturbing self-deception is on display in the following clips from a YouTube video called Natural Family Planning Couple Sharing. In these clips, we first see a typically false attempt to contrast artificial contraception with NFP. In artificial contraception, they say, a couple, by attempting to avoid the procreative aspect of marriage, holds back something of themselves, Yet in using NFP, they claim, through which a couple also tries to avoid the procreative aspect of marriage, the couple gives of themselves completely. They then blasphemously compare using NFP, a birth control method, to Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and they say that the decision about whether they should have a child is their choice. The removal of God from the picture, the exclusion of His choice and His plan from the process, having been replaced with a sort of cult of man, is striking.
When a couple holds back and uses an artificial form of contraception, they're not giving themselves completely and totally to one another. By using natural family planning, a couple is able to really give of themselves completely.
When we answer this first question in church on our wedding day, we're really saying that we're giving ourselves to each other fully and totally without holding anything back.
Kind of like Jesus did on the cross and how He does every day in the Eucharist for us.
Right. You know, it's not, you know, my choice to have a kid or not. It's our choice.
Yeah.
Couples find that when they practice natural family planning, that they're able to more easily imitate this sacrificial love.
Give me a break. In the following clip, it is stated that it's wrong to separate sex from fertility, and that contraceptives make that separation and place an unacceptable barrier between the spouses. The speakers are apparently oblivious to the fact that NFP also separates sexual activity from fertility through a plan to avoid a woman's fertility for selfish reasons. The hypocrisy, the failure to recognize that they engage in and promote the very thing they denounce, is stunning.
And we can't separate this love that Christ has for us from the respect that Giovanni and I have to have for each other. Because love without respect, it wouldn't be love at all. It would just be lust for each other. And we have to apply this also to our sexuality, that we cannot separate sex and fertility, that we have to accept them together, and that we can't hold anything back.
I don't want to place any barriers between Lauren and I by using contraceptives. By placing those barriers between us, I cannot give myself fully to her. I would be holding something back and being selfish in doing so.
In the following clips, we are told on the one hand that couples who use NFP can avoid pregnancy and determine the number of children they will have. Yet we are also told that these couples remain open to the children God will send. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Some couples might come to the ceremony thinking that they're only supposed to have maybe 1 or maybe 2 children. Some couples may approach the ceremony and say, well, we're not going to have children for the first 5 years. But if a couple is using natural family planning, they are able to remain open to however many children that God might bless them with. They're also able to remain open to the timetable that God would have them use. They are able to responsibly plan when to have a child and also how many children.
In the next clip, we are told the following staggering things. 1, that this newly married couple is not ready for children. Yet 2, children are a great blessing, even if difficult to raise. And Christ's example shows us that we must do difficult things out of love. And 3, God always takes care of us. So we are told that God will take care of us, that we must follow Christ's example of embracing difficult things out of love, such as having and raising children. Yet, they don't want the blessing of children. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? No, it doesn't make any sense to people who can see the truth and love the truth. But for those lost in the NFP deception, this kind of contradictory doublespeak is standard operating procedure.
We've been married for 2 weeks now, and there's a lot of people in our lives that would like us to have children right now, but we're not ready for that just yet.
Even though we know it's going to be a great blessing and a great gift to have children, we also know it's not always going to be easy, just as Christ dying for us on the cross wasn't easy, but an act of love.
And Jesus is the perfect example for how we need to live, and we would like to teach our children that same example.
God's always taken care of me. I trust that He'll always provide for my family.
In Matthew 7:13-14, Jesus told us that few are saved. When we consider that almost everyone either uses artificial contraception, which is mortally sinful, contrary to Catholic teaching and the Bible, or NFP, also mortally sinful, contrary to Catholic teaching and the Bible, it should be clear that multitudes are on the path to hell as a result of the birth control sin. Finally, the frightening dishonesty at the heart of the NFP lie is perhaps most effectively captured in the following clips from a YouTube video called Why Use Natural Family Planning, put out by the Vatican II, Archdiocese of Chicago. It's difficult to more powerfully capture the snare in which NFP supporters have been caught than to see their delusion on display. In the following clips, notice that these users of NFP, who admit that NFP is birth control, that it is used to avoid children, have simultaneously convinced themselves that they are, open to life, open to children, end quote. They make this astounding declaration just before telling us that they decide when to avoid a child for financial or other reasons. They also declare that NFP is so different from artificial contraception, for that goes against conception. They tell us this while they discuss how NFP is used to avoid conception. Having strayed from God's faith and having resisted His will, they have become blind to the depths of Satan and how the enemy of mankind deceives. They are lost in his web of lies, where contradictory declarations aren't considered incompatible, but the very foundation of a false light, a false reality, and a false peace from the father of lies.
My parents always said the phrase natural family planning in my upbringing, and I never really knew what it meant, but I just knew that it was something I should look into.
We also heard about the health benefits for the woman's body as being an all-natural method. And then also just about the impact it would have on just closeness and having a loving marriage. We decided to try right away.
I can't even begin to put a price tag on how much it fills the emotional need of a woman. You know, every woman wants to be romanced and held and courted, and that's what happens naturally.
By doing NFP, we both agreed that we're open to life and we're open to children. So we're putting that out there, and so every month we talk about it, Every month, do we have the money, or don't we have the money? Are we ready? Is the baby old enough? Are we comfortable now?
Well, it's so different from contraception that it's not artificial.
Right.
It's not putting something that goes against conception. It's natural, and certainly the church approves of natural family planning.
NFP should be a part of everyone's marriage. I have friends who aren't Catholic, and we talk to them about it, and they view it as just a church, the Catholic Church's birth control. And I try to explain that it's so much more than that.
Whether we're working to avoid or achieve a baby, we're trusting God's plan.
Yeah, who better to trust than God?
Exactly. By doing NFP, we both agreed that we're open to life and we're open to children.